Digital infrastructure enables us to connect with one another and make sense of the vast amount of data with which we are faced. Today's panel examines connectivity assets, that is, those assets which are essential to the movement and storage of data. I'm Annie Satchcroft, Head of Macquarie Asset Management's Digital Infrastructure team in Sydney, and I'm joined by three leaders in the digital infrastructure space. With me in the studio are Robin Coulter, founder and CEO of AirTrunk, Ellie Sweeney, COO of Vocus, and online from Cincinnati at a slightly uncivilised hour, Lee Fox, President and CEO of Cincinnati Bell. If you have any questions for Robin, Lee or Ellie during the session, please add them to the Q&A box at the bottom of the player. Welcome everyone. And to get started, I'm actually going to talk to you, Lee. So one of the things that we were joking about is that in this conference, we are the slow panel. A lot of the conference has been about technology, how quickly it's evolving. But actually, when you contrast that to traditional notions of infrastructure, large assets at scale, serving whole communities, it is quite a different notion. So as you think about digital infrastructure, how do you reconcile these two concepts?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. Look, it is technology. So there are parts of what we service that do move quickly, but for the most part, you're talking about massive investments, right, for long life assets, and so it's very capital intensive. It's specialized construction, and you do have to think well ahead. We've been investing in fiber for over a decade. And we're still, I would say, we're only where we need to be in fiber to the prem, which we think is the gold standard. We're only halfway to the goal in our service territory. So it is a very long-term play. It is very capital intensive, which means there is a pretty high barrier to entry. So in doing that, those kind of investments, there's a lot you need to think about. So at the same time that you get sort of, stuck into these quick IT conversations where, things do move fast and people want to invest quickly and they see trends shifting, you also sort of have to keep your eye on the ball long term. And you have to watch, ultimately how the infrastructure is being used, how data is being used. And that is really what determines your decision. So what we really focus on is cash flow investment, focusing on cash flow. How do you monetize what you're investing in, right? The worst thing you can do is, effectively bury money into the ground in our case and not get a return on that investment, right? And so we're very careful about it. We watch our demographics. We watch our customers very carefully, and we service a wide array of customers. So you really, in our space, you can't sort of get distracted by the new interesting thing or sort of shift yourself to a trend. I say this a lot. Engineers tend to, be very fascinated with building things just because you can, right? And a lot of the questions we ask are, look, I know you can, but should you? And should you now, right? And so we're very focused on our customers. We're very focused on that monetization. And within our customers, we service every demographic here. So if you think about what we do, we supply the plumbing for the data and everyone uses the data. So as you look to monetize it, you really have to look through every demographic and how are they going to monetize it? How are you going to service that infrastructure to that end client? And then how do you explain that transition to them? For some of the younger demographics, early adopters, they get it, right? They get it right away. But for folks that are, in older demographics and are still phenomenal customers, I always use my mother as an example to our team. We're big believers in simplification. So it's how would you explain this to my mom, right? When you give fiber to her home, and we give her a service, how can we make it easy? And candidly, she just moved, so I'm going through this live example over the last few weeks, and it's been pretty interesting. I would say my mom is like customer number one on everyone's dashboard right now. But it's really important that you service every single one of those customers because, the technology is something that is meant to be used by everyone. And the usage of data is being used by everyone. And that shifting in how things are used that does shift rapidly, but we look at it as our job is effectively like the data plumbers, right, to make this as simple and straightforward as humanly possible. So as investors, heavy investors in infrastructure, we sort of stick to those premise, be patient, specialized construction means, managing cash flow effectively and really, really listening to our customers and how they use it and how we can monetize that usage.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think that point that you've made about the hallmarks of infrastructure being that they need to serve the entirety of the community are very pertinent. And I think one of the things that we've actually found really fascinating about the last 18 months has actually been seeing the different ways or the different speeds at which people have evolved to quite pressured circumstances in some cases of working with technology and digital infrastructure. And so a question for you, Robin, coming from the data center background and having this data center platform, what has surprised you the most about the last 18 months in the terms of the way people have adapted to the use of digital infrastructure?
Yeah, thank you, Annie, and thanks for having me here as well. I think fair to say digital evolution started way before COVID. We're moving to the technology over time using more cloud-based services. COVID really accelerated that transition to the digital services. Probably, I think from data center point of view and cloud point of view, I think probably the thing really surprised me how quickly people adopted to new technology. A lot of people, they were very skeptical about using technology, but I think COVID forced them to adapt to the technology. So it actually changed the way we work, we play, we live, we do everything. If you think about the work, when COVID started, I think within the first 6 months, Zoom added 100 million new users in a very short period of time. Those people, they don't have to go to office for a long time. Microsoft added over 30 million users. The way we live, we're relying on, rather than going to the physical shopping center, we are utilizing online-based shopping. You look at Alibaba, for example, through their platform, in a year, their e-commerce volume grew from 35 million to 74 million. So more and more people shopping online. You look at entertainment, Disney added over 100 million users since its launch. We're watching more entertainment as well. So I think sort of the bottom to it is COVID has been an enabler. It's actually accelerated. Talking to a lot of CIOs of large companies, they had a digital strategy and they were waiting to adopt to that strategy sort of over a 5-year period. When COVID started, that forced a lot of the CIOs to move to the cloud-based services or the new technologies. So I think it's quite interesting to see in a short period of time how things has changed. And I think this is going to be the preview for what's going to happen in future as well.
Yeah. And I think the point that you're making, Robin, about in times of pressure, that's actually when you see how quickly people can adapt and adopt is fascinating. One of the things that we speak about here quite a lot at Macquarie is this whole notion of the social license to operate when you're speaking about infrastructure companies. So the fact that you are actually providing the community with an essential service, and you need to keep providing that community with a service, through all times and maintain that social license. One of the things I find fascinating, Ellie, about Vocus is actually how do you think about that social license in that context?
Annie, I think it's fair to say that at Vocus, we feel incredibly lucky and very proud to work in an industry that I think by its very nature has a clear social license to operate. And if you think about the last day and a half here at the Tech Summit, those innovations that we've been speaking about, I'd have to say they rely on a digital infrastructure that is reliable, that is secure, that is ubiquitous, that's affordable, and that has a level of innovation. And if I could pick any of the sessions I was lucky enough to listen to. You know, the SpaceX session yesterday, if I was listening to the sessions around providing people with a disability a level of independence, or healthcare to people who never would have, you know, been able to access it, or the democratization of industry, all that really lofty ambition of being able to go to the moon or to Mars, then I think that social license to operate is just incredibly clear. You know, if we needed to bring it to the fore, I think clearly COVID did. I think about the response that we saw globally within this industry. You know, you saw the global telcos really come together. Vast amount of information was shared around what was happening on those networks to ensure that as we did go into lockdown, either in countries or in cities or counties, that people were aware of how it was going to impact their networks and could really plan for it. In our own country here in Australia, I think the ISPs got together with the National Broadband Network and did an incredible job to uplift the broadband capacity for people so that people really could live and work overnight when we shifted to having to work from home. And that includes the gamers, that includes people living, working, but also obviously school. And I think we would be part of an industry that would be saying, amongst others, that we actually kept the global economy and the national economy going. You know, in my own company, when COVID hit, there was just an ethos that we would do anything to get things done for our customers, for our government customers, for our corporate customers. And, you know, delivery times, quite frankly, went from, in some respects, weeks to days and in even minutes. But I think, look, the true meta of an organisation is not when you're just faced with a crisis. What happens in the runtime. And you've already heard Lee mention that, you know, this is a capital investor heavy industry that we work in. And I think we all take a lot of pride in the fact that we really do change how people live and work. You know, in my company, again, we spend a lot in terms of our digital footprint, but increasingly around the fibre footprint in Australia. It's a regional footprint. And again, we're delighted that we think that drives, you know, a digital equalisation for regional Australia, which is great. We're very proud of the work we do in the Indo-Pacific region, so really supporting our neighbours. You mentioned infrastructure. We think that having digital infrastructure into places like Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Tiwi Islands is just as important as having ports and also as roads. And I couldn't, you know, be at a conference and not talk about security, you know, that social license to operate. Our customers, be it the government customers, be it our consumer customers, enterprise customers, are demanding just a heightened level of security across all of their networks. And, you know, we take that just incredibly seriously. And it's part of the investment I think most people within this industry would be making. Hey, look, I couldn't finish without one last point. I think social license to operate is just inherent in this industry. And I could make the case very easily for some others. But I'd also add that I think the culture of the organisations that we work in really start to come into play here, very much around, you know, why we do operate. And again, I go back to my, you know, opening comment. It's great to work in an industry which I think by its inherent nature has a social license to operate.
Thanks, Ellie. And look, when you kind of hear you speak, Robin, Lee, it's really easy to think about these networks and these assets as being all-encompassing and spanning vast tracts of countries. But Lee, one of the things that actually we've been speaking about has been what happens when that access is maybe suboptimal or not reaching quite all of the people in the community that it needs to. So over the past 18 months, Cincinnati Bell's been thinking a little bit about digital equality or digital inequality, and I'm keen to hear your reflections on this.
Yeah, you know, I couldn't agree with Ellie more from the standpoint of, you know, we view our role in the community is that we have a social responsibility to the community. And what we found, especially during COVID with kind of the displacement of everyone, right, is that the digital infrastructure investments that were made by companies and school systems sort of broke, right? And if you think about how they made their investments for a certain, you know, traverse of data, right? It works in this direction, it's absorbed in this way, and suddenly that was kind of thrown on its head. And so what we found locally is that we had a large percentage of students, especially in our largest school system here in Cincinnati, that almost disappeared from the system. And so we started to work really closely with CPS, Cincinnati Public Schools, and really started to identify where those students were and what is it that we can do. And unfortunately, the type of infrastructure needed to be invested in 5 years ago. right? Not now, right? We were too late. But what we were able to do was really identify these people and come up with various solutions that got the necessary infrastructure to them and got some type of infrastructure. So maybe it's not fiber to the prem, but maybe it's better internet than they had. But along with that is affordable internet, right? So a lot of what these families suffered from is they not only didn't have access to internet, they couldn't afford it. And affordability was a big issue. And so we built locally public-private partnerships that actually gave access to, delivering free internet. And that's not discounted. It was free internet to 20% of the school system students. So we were able to supply that internet for free to 20% of the students. And if you look at the demographic of those students, 91% of that 20% are students of color, and 95% of that population were what we consider socially disadvantaged or economically disadvantaged. So it's not just the ability to access the data, which isn't there. The investment needed. Again, we're only 50% covered in our footprint, so we have a lot of work to do. But it's also, you have to make it affordable. And again, part of the social license that we have and the responsibility that we have as a business, you have to solve that problem for the community. And so those are some of the things that we did here locally.
Fantastic, Lee. Thank you for sharing that. And that whole concept of needing to think forward, so digital infrastructure being something which needs to be planned years in advance, which requires the requisite level of quite high capital expenditure investment. As you all think about the challenges or the upcoming challenges for the community, what do you think are the innovations in technology that digital infrastructure needs to start thinking about addressing now? And I might start with you, Robin, for this first question.
Yeah, look, digital infrastructure is not different to you building a toll road or you building utility infrastructure. Of course, it's supporting a vast amount of population as well. So, and I think what's really important from digital infrastructure point of view is it needs to be scalable. To support the growth of existing and the new population as well. It needs to be reliable as well, secure. That's really important because the data sovereignty issues, and probably finally the sustainability. It's a big portion, or we call ESG, digital infrastructure supporting a lot of population, consuming a lot of power, a lot of water, all those precious assets, and we need to make sure this infrastructure we are building is sustainable way for our future generation, and also scalable as well. And we're already seeing from data center point of view, which the industry we operate, there is an enormous focus on efficiency, from energy efficiency, the water efficiency, etc. Also, we're seeing in the capital market as well, the sustainability linked financing that's becoming more and more important as well. So there is a lot of innovation happening from the way we build, the way we operate, and the way we finance those infrastructure as well.
Yep. And Ellie?
Hey, we've been talking a lot about low Earth orbit satellites, and I know in Sydney, I think there's a conference at the moment that's going on. I spoke at a conference in, I think, October of last year, and I said I'd be really excited to see what was going to happen in low Earth orbit satellites over the next year. I really didn't have to wait a year. If you were on the calls yesterday and you heard the COO of SpaceX speak at the Tech Summit here, she was fantastic. Low Earth orbit satellite, in terms of what it's doing for broadband for consumers, is just phenomenal. And I think, the beta testing that Starlink already have is something like 11 countries, 100,000 users already, 400,000 in backlog. And look, the reason it's really exciting is that it's, if you think about traditional satellite, 36,000 kilometres above the Earth, low Earth orbit, 550 kilometres above the Earth, millisecond speeds, which are really comparable to 5G and also to terrestrial broadband. Look, there are so many use cases. Obviously, broadband for consumers is one of them, potentially IoT, so whether it's 4G or 5G, really exciting in that space. You can see the applications across mining, across agriculture, across defence. There are just so many applications here. And it's exciting for us at Vocus because, quite frankly, you know, to enable that, you need the fibre, you need the controlled environment vaults, and you also need the spectrum. So look, we're incredibly excited about LEO. It won't replace, or we don't think it's going to replace 5G and obviously broadband. But again, if you go back to the commentary around social license, we really do think it's going to enable for people in regional and also remote areas just a level of connectivity that they don't have today. So I think low Earth orbit moving faster than we ever expected, and a really exciting technology coming into that digital infrastructure we've just been speaking about.
Thanks, Ellie. And finally to you, Lee.
Yeah, you know, I think you know, both made, you know, incredible points. I would say the only thing I would add is I think some of it's actually happening now. You know, Ellie mentioned SpaceX and what they're doing with low Earth orbit satellites. You know, the way we think about innovation is, especially in our space, it ends up being about, you know, the ands and not the ors. So, you know, true disruption really, in my mind, is a this or that. What we're seeing in infrastructure is really just the, you know, at fiber and 5G and low Earth orbit. And so there, you know, we need more investment in all of these things in order to reach as many people as possible. And that's really what's key. And some of the things that need to happen is, you know, especially here in the US, we need to start to clear the way, you know, regulatory wise and politically, you know, to you know, increase the pace of these investments. But for investors, you know, the thing I would encourage is really that and concept, that there is a place for all of it, right? And all of them need investment. And we need to encourage, you know, the increase in pace of investment in all of it. And one is not going to be the replacement of the other. And, you know, soon we're going to find a way that these things are, you know, linked together and they service, you know, everyone, whether you're in an urban community or rural community or you know, in the, you know, in a cabin in Alaska, you know, you've got 100 megs internet, which would be life changing for someone, you know, and think about how that changes work and the whole dynamics. And, you know, and I think we're on our way. You know, I think COVID has done that for us. It's really accelerated that, you know, and highlighted the need for this utility. And it is. It's a utility. It is a necessary utility. So, so that's really all it is just to think about it as an and, that we need all of this together.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Lee, Ellie and Robin, for those answers. We are now actually going to throw to the audience to see if there's been any Q&A come in for you. And the first question, Robin, is actually one for you. So as we talk about infrastructure, again, sort of looping back to the theme that we started with, people are used to thinking about these, you know, heavy assets, large amounts of investments at scale. It's actually very rare to see a founder-led infrastructure company. So one of the things that we're quite keen to hear from you about is, how has founding an infrastructure company made you think about technology and infrastructure investment?
Yeah, no, Ani, that's of course a very, very good question as well. So look, of course, the infrastructure is very capital intensive type of business. You know, it's a big barrier to entry. I think Ellie mentioned before. Also, you know, it sort of you're dealing with very sophisticated customers as well. In our case, some of the large technology companies. And when I started AirTrunk, I think sort of like any sort of other, I would say, successful businesses, it's always started with what are the challenges I'm looking to solve, and the challenge was when I started, and you know, the traditional data center, they were not scalable, they were not future ready. You know, we talked about a lot of the future, and I had that in mind, that you know, how I'm gonna provide the infrastructure for future in the cloud, etc. They need the scale, they need speed of deployment, they need focus on sustainability, focus on efficiency, reliability, etc. So that was started with what is the problem trying to solve and how it's going to solve long term, and having that sort of strong proposition to the customer, that really enabled me to sort of start the company and attracted institutional investor as well to deploy capital and build this long-term infrastructure supporting the future generation.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much, Robin. That's a great perspective, and one which, as I say, we don't usually tend to hear in connection with infrastructure companies. So fantastic to have a founder-led infrastructure company. The next one, Lee, has come in for you. It's a question around, actually, it's a fascinating one around the way you assess digital infrastructure opportunities. So again, a lot of the discussion around technology is about spotting what is likely to be the next big, trend or phenomena. With digital infrastructure, there's a little bit more of that balance. So spotting the opportunities, as you've been all speaking about, but also making sure that you don't dive in so early that you actually end up losing a lot of that investment. So from your perspective, Lee, can you give us any words of wisdom on how you try and assess when the right point is to dive into digital infrastructure?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I can only sort of tell you what we do, right? And I think if investors think like this, I think it at least adds another kind of level of analysis. But when we started to invest in fiber, we looked at a few things. We looked at the physics involved, and what was happening with data, how data was growing, and then how that related to the physics of the various mediums of how data was going to be delivered. And if you believed in the physics, then you believed in fiber, right? So that was the first thing. Then we looked at our customer buying patterns, right? And we said, okay, today they buy X, Y, and Z, but we see trends, trailing off in certain things. And for us, it was really interesting, as a legacy telco, 15 years ago, it was all about the access line until, we realized about a decade ago that we were looking at the wrong thing. Our consumers, our end customers really cared about the internet. And as you saw the internet change and the usage change, you saw customers leave for better usage, and they took everything with them. And so that was, something that we really keyed on. So a lot of what we do is we look at customer behavior, how customers are buying, the physics around the technology, and then we look at just cash flow management. I mean, I hate to say it's that simple, but it really is that simple about, look, what's the pace and how you're investing? Watch the pace in terms of you don't want to be, stuck in a position where you bury dollars into the ground and you get no return for it. And in fact, I just talked to an infrastructure provider, a pretty big one here in the United States recently, and they asked us the question of, look, we're building so quickly, we can't install, right? We don't have the resources. So how do you guys do it? And that's a problem, right? There's a lot of things to juggle here. So there are a lot of things we look at from the pacing standpoint, but it mainly comes down to cash flow and how do you manage cash effectively for your investors.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much, Lee. And then finally, a quick one for you, Ellie. As you think about culture in a company, and it's something that's been discussed quite a lot over the last few days, how do you balance that need to innovate and to deal with all this evolving technology with being in a company which is, by its very nature, quite construction heavy and focused on serving such large portions of the community?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm fascinated over the last couple of days just hearing so many people talk about culture, and the founder of Zoom today was just an exemplar of, I think, doing that, and I was so impressed. Hey, look, I don't think they're exclusive, and I think it's about having a culture that is about innovation, which is about making sure that we are doing something which is actually contributing to the communities that we operate in. And I suppose the lucky thing when you work in this industry is that we can look at anything, any innovation, any application that is digitized today and start thinking about that we actually deliver that. So I think from my perspective, they're not exclusive, they're very much together. And I think it does go back to then that culture and the vision of the organizations that we work in, which are really about, at its most fundamental level, connecting people. And I can't think of a more exciting thing to be part of.
Thanks very much, Ellie, and a fantastic note on which to finish. So thank you, Lee, Ellie and Robin today for a great discussion. As technology continues to progress, obviously the digital infrastructure backbone which supports it is vitally important, and it's been a fantastic discussion on your perspectives on that infrastructure.